I shouldn't have let Marcus come over. That thought has been running circles in my mind since the moment he walked out my front door. I knew it was a mistake before it even happened, but somehow, I convinced myself it would be fine. I was wrong, so wrong, and now everything feels broken in a way I don't know how to fix. My name is Laura, and I'm 32 years old. On paper, my life looks good. I live in a quiet neighborhood in Ohio with my husband, Kevin, who's 36, and our 2 kids, Jack and Lily. Jack's 8 and Lily's 5, both full of energy and innocent chaos. We've been married for 9 years, and for most of that time, I thought we were solid. Stable. A normal family with the usual ups and downs. But lately, something's been off. Kevin's a good man, don't get me wrong. He works hard at the local warehouse, pays the bills, helps out with the kids. Everything you'd expect from a reliable partner. But that's just it, he's reliable. Always there, but never fully present. There's no spark, no ambition. Sometimes it feels like I'm living with a roommate instead of a husband. And me? I'm no angel in this either. I work as an assistant at a small marketing firm where my boss, Marcus, seems to light up every room he enters. He's 44, sharp, confident, and commanding, the kind of person who makes everyone stop and listen when he speaks. Maybe that's why I started noticing him more. It wasn't intentional at first. But when you're around someone who commands respect, who seems to have everything figured out, it's hard not to compare them to the person waiting for you at home. I didn't mean to let it happen, but it did. Slowly, subtly, Marcus started creeping into my thoughts more than Kevin did. I'd talk about him at home, his ideas, his leadership, his jokes, and I told myself it was harmless. But deep down, I knew better. And then came that Friday night. We had a work event, one of those casual after-hours things where everyone complains about clients and drinks too much. Marcus being Marcus, he suggested we keep the night going with a few drinks at someone's place. I told him I couldn't. I had to get home to my family. But then he looked at me and said, "Why don't I just come with you? I'll bring a bottle." I laughed, thinking he was joking. But he wasn't. And for reasons I still can't fully explain, I said yes. Maybe I wanted to prove something. Prove that my life was more than just laundry piles and mac and cheese dinners. Prove that I had a picture-perfect family, a warm and welcoming home, a life worth envying. Looking back, I know how naive that was. That night didn't prove anything except how fragile my marriage really was. It was the start of a mess I don't know if I can clean up. The thing about cracks in a marriage is that they don't show up all at once. They creep in quietly, like water seeping into the foundation of a house. By the time you notice them, it's already too late. For Kevin and me, those cracks had been forming for years. On paper, everything seemed fine. We had 2 beautiful kids, Jack, who loves soccer and building forts in the living room, and Lily, who's obsessed with unicorns and singing way too loudly in the car. Kevin had his job at the warehouse, which he'd been at for years. He was dependable, always making sure we had what we needed. Bills paid, cars serviced, groceries stocked. He was the kind of man anyone would say is a good husband. But good doesn't mean fulfilling. Kevin was always there. Physically, at least. But emotionally? It felt like he'd checked out a long time ago. He'd come home from work, give me a quick kiss on the cheek, and settle into the couch with the remote in hand. The kids adored him. He's a great dad, no doubt. But as a partner, I felt like I was carrying the weight of us alone. I remember the first time I noticed it. I'd spent hours putting together a presentation for my boss, Marcus, at work. It was a big deal for me, something I'd never been trusted with before. That night, I came home buzzing with excitement, ready to tell Kevin all about it. But when I started talking, he barely looked up from the basketball game he was watching. He nodded in all the right places, muttered, "That's great," and went back to his TV. That moment stung. And it wasn't just that one time. It was a pattern. I'd talk, he'd listen halfway. I'd suggest a date night, he'd say he was too tired. I'd try to have a real conversation, and he'd shut it down with a joke or shrug. The connection we once had was fading, and I didn't know how to get it back. It wasn't just him, though. I know that now. I was changing too. At work, I was surrounded by people like Marcus, confident, ambitious, full of ideas. It was intoxicating being around someone who commanded a room, who made you feel like your ideas mattered. The more time I spent in that environment, the more I found myself comparing it to what I had at home. And the comparisons weren't kind to Kevin. I tried not to let those thoughts take root, but they did. Slowly, subtly, they grew until I couldn't ignore them anymore. I started resenting Kevin for his lack of ambition, for being so comfortable in his routine. I wanted more passion, more excitement, more everything. But how do you tell your husband that the life you've built together isn't enough for you anymore? How do you say, I love you, but I need more? I didn't have an answer. So, instead of talking to Kevin, I buried those feelings deep and carried on like everything was fine. And then Marcus walked into my life, and those feelings I'd been ignoring suddenly had a spotlight on them. He was everything Kevin wasn't: dynamic, driven, magnetic. Being around him made me feel alive in a way I hadn't felt in years. I knew it was dangerous, comparing the two, but I couldn't stop myself. That's how the cracks in my marriage widened. Not with a bang, but with the quiet realization that I was starting to want something or someone else. And by the time I realized how far those cracks had spread, it was too late to stop what was coming next. The night Marcus came over felt like a slow-motion disaster, and I couldn't look away. I replay it in my mind constantly, wondering what would have happened if I'd just said no. But I didn't. I let him come, and that decision changed everything. It started innocently enough, or at least that's what I told myself. Marcus had suggested drinks after our work event, something casual to keep the night going. I declined at first, thinking about Kevin and the kids waiting for me at home. But then Marcus, with his signature charm, turned the idea on its head. Why not just invite me over? He'd said with a grin. I'll bring a bottle, and we'll keep it classy. No harm, no foul. I laughed, thinking he couldn't possibly be serious. Who brings their boss into their home, especially unplanned? But Marcus wasn't joking. He leaned in, his voice dropping just enough to make it feel like a challenge. Come on, Laura. You've got nothing to prove, right? Let's see this picture-perfect life you keep talking about. And that was it. That one comment, whether it was meant to be playful or not, hit me in a way I didn't expect. I didn't want to admit it, but I wanted him to see my life. To see that I had something solid, stable, something worth respecting. Maybe I even wanted to prove it to myself. So, I said yes. And the second I pulled into the driveway with Marcus in tow, my stomach sank. Kevin's car was parked where it always was, and the lights from the living room spilled out onto the lawn. It looked warm, inviting, everything I wanted it to be. But as soon as we stepped inside, that illusion shattered. Kevin was on the couch in his usual uniform, sweatpants, and an old college t-shirt. He had a bowl of popcorn in his lap, some cop show blaring on the TV. The kids were sprawled out on the floor, completely absorbed in their tablets. It wasn't the picture-perfect scene I'd imagined. It was just us. Our messy, ordinary life. Hey, babe, I said, forcing a cheerful tone as I stepped inside. This is Marcus, my boss. I told you about him, right? He's just stopping by for a bit. Kevin glanced up briefly, his expression neutral. Oh, okay, he muttered, barely looking at Marcus before turning his attention back to the TV. I felt a pang of embarrassment before Marcus even said a word. But of course, Marcus didn't seem fazed. He strode into the room like he owned the place, setting the bottle of wine on the counter and surveying his surroundings. Nice little setup you've got here, he said, his tone hovering somewhere between a compliment and a jab. Real cozy. Kevin didn't respond. Maybe he didn't catch the tone, or maybe he did and just chose to ignore it. Either way, the tension was palpable, and I could feel my face growing warm. While I busied myself grabbing glasses from the kitchen, I overheard their awkward exchange. Marcus, ever the conversationalist, tried to draw Kevin into small talk. So, what do you do, Kevin? He asked casually. I work at the shipping center on Broad Street, Kevin replied without looking away from the TV. Shipping center, huh? Marcus's voice lifted slightly, the way it does when he's pretending to be impressed. Man, that sounds like tough work. Bet it's not easy on the back. Kevin shrugged. "It's fine," he said, his tone clipped. Marcus chuckled, and I froze at the counter. I knew that laugh. It wasn't friendly. It was the kind of laugh that says, "I'm better than you," and I hated that I knew Kevin heard it too. When I peeked out of the kitchen, I saw Kevin's jaw tighten, his eyes narrowing as he stared at the TV. He didn't say anything, but the tension in the room was thick enough to choke on. I poured the wine quickly, hoping to diffuse the situation. But as we sat at the dining table, the unease only grew. Marcus dominated the conversation, talking about work, travel, and all the things Kevin had no interest in. Kevin sat with his arms crossed, barely contributing a word. I asked him twice if he was okay, and both times he just nodded, his jaw still clenched. And then Marcus said it. The comment that changed everything. "You ever think about what life would be like if you married a guy like me, Laura? Not saying you should, just, life might look a little different, huh?" I froze. The laugh that slipped out of me was automatic, a nervous reaction I didn't mean. But the second it happened, I regretted it. Not because of Marcus, but because of Kevin. His eyes locked on mine, sharp and unyielding. "You think that's funny?" he asked quietly. "Oh, come on, Kevin. He's joking." "Lighten up," I said, trying to brush it off. Kevin leaned forward, his voice low but cutting. "You laughed a little too hard for it to be just a joke." "Don't be so sensitive," I muttered, but even as I said it, I knew I was wrong. Kevin's next words hit me like a punch. "Yeah, but he ain't in everybody's house. He's in mine." The silence that followed was deafening. Marcus, for once, had nothing to say. Kevin pushed back from the table and left the room without another word. Later that night, he walked out the back door, and I didn't see him again until the next morning. By then, I knew something had shifted. Something I couldn't take back. The morning after Marcus's visit felt heavier than it should have. Kevin hadn't come back into the house until well after midnight, and, even then, he barely said a word. I lay awake in bed, pretending to sleep as I listened to his footsteps move through the house, slow, deliberate, like he was trying not to wake the kids. I wanted to call out to him, to say something, but pride kept me silent. When I finally woke up, he was already gone. No note, no text, just the faint smell of his cologne lingering in the air, a ghost of his presence. Normally, I wouldn't have thought much of it. Kevin leaving early wasn't unusual, especially if he wanted to get to work before the traffic hit. But something about the way he'd left felt different, like he'd taken more than just his keys with him. The house felt off that day. The kids were their usual chaotic selves, Jack practicing soccer moves in the living room and Lily demanding pancakes shaped like hearts. But even their noise couldn't drown out the nagging voice in my head, replaying the night before. Kevin's words stuck with me. "He ain't in everybody's house. He's in mine." The way he said it, quiet but firm, had hit a nerve. I hated the way it made me feel, like I'd crossed a line I hadn't even realized was there. As I poured syrup over Lily's pancakes, I caught myself glancing at the clock. It was almost noon, and I still hadn't heard from Kevin. Normally, he'd at least send me a quick text, even if it was just to ask if the kids were behaving. But my phone stayed silent, and with each passing hour, the knot in my stomach tightened. By evening, worry had turned to frustration. Where was he? Why wasn't he answering his phone? I told myself it was fine, that he just needed some space, but deep down, I was spiraling. Was he punishing me for last night? Was this his way of making a point? When Kevin finally walked through the door, the tension in the air was almost suffocating. He looked tired. Not the kind of tired you feel after a long day at work, but something deeper. His shoulders were slouched, and there was a heaviness in his eyes that I couldn't quite place. "Where have you been?" I asked, trying to keep my voice steady. He didn't answer right away. Instead, he brushed past me, heading straight for the kitchen. The smell of stale beer clung to him, and my heart sank. "Kevin, I'm talking to you," I pressed, following him. "You leave all day without a word, and now you're just going to ignore me?" He sighed, leaning against the counter as he unscrewed a bottle of water. "I didn't feel like talking," he muttered, his voice flat. "Didn't feel like talking?" I repeated, my voice rising. "You could have at least told me where you were." "I was worried." His laugh was bitter, more like a snort. You? Worried? That's rich. The comment stung more than I cared to admit. What's that supposed to mean? I shot back, stepping closer. Kevin finally looked at me then, really looked at me, and what I saw in his eyes made my stomach drop. There was no anger, no frustration, just exhaustion. The kind of exhaustion that comes from carrying something too heavy for too long. You only worry when you're not in control, Laura, he said quietly. This isn't about me. His words hit me like a slap. I opened my mouth to argue, to defend myself, but nothing came out. I stood there, rooted to the spot, as he walked past me and into the living room. Later that night, we barely spoke. The silence between us was louder than any argument we'd ever had. I kept telling myself it was just a rough patch, that we'd get through it like we always did. But deep down, I knew this was different. Something had shifted between us, and I didn't know how to fix it. As I lay in bed that night, staring at the ceiling, I couldn't stop replaying the look on Kevin's face. The exhaustion. The hurt. The quiet resignation that felt like a door closing. I wanted to reach out, to bridge the gap between us, but I didn't know how. Instead, I stayed silent, telling myself it was just one bad day. But as the days stretched on and Kevin's silence grew louder, I started to wonder if it was something more. If maybe this wasn't just a bad day, maybe it was the beginning of the end. The silence between Kevin and me became its own living thing, heavy and oppressive, filling every room in the house. After that night, we stopped talking not just about Marcus, but about anything. He barely said a word to me, and when he did, his tone was so distant it felt like he wasn't really speaking to me at all. Kevin had always been a quiet guy, but this was different. It wasn't the calm, comfortable silence we used to share when we'd sit together on the couch after the kids went to bed. No, this silence had sharp edges, and it cut into me every time I tried to ignore it. He started coming home later than usual. Some nights, he'd text a short message, working late. Other nights, he wouldn't bother texting at all. The kids noticed it too. Jack, our 8-year-old, asked me one night, "Is Dad mad at you?" I brushed it off, telling him that Daddy was just busy with work, but I could see the doubt in his little face. And me? I was unraveling. Every time Kevin walked through the door, his presence, or maybe his absence, gnawed at me. He'd move through the house like a ghost, quietly helping the kids with their homework or sitting with them during dinner, barely acknowledging me. I tried to act normal at first. I cooked his favorite meals, made small talk about the kids, even laughed at the dumb jokes in the shows we used to watch together. But he didn't bite. It was like he'd built a wall between us, and I had no idea how to climb over it. One night, I decided I'd had enough. He came home late again, his footsteps dragging as he walked through the door. I was waiting for him in the kitchen, arms crossed, ready for a fight. "Kevin," I started, my voice sharper than I intended. "Are we really going to keep doing this? Walking around like strangers in our own house?" He didn't look at me right away. He set his keys down on the counter with a deliberate slowness that made my skin crawl. Finally, he turned to me, his expression blank but his eyes heavy. "I'm tired, Laura," he said simply. "Tired?" I repeated, throwing my hands in the air. "Tired of what? Me? The kids? This house? What, Kevin? Just say it." He sighed, shaking his head as he walked past me. "You wouldn't get it." That stopped me cold. "Wouldn't get what?" I snapped, following him into the living room. "You've barely spoken to me in days, Kevin. If something's wrong, just say it." He turned to face me then, his eyes darker than I'd ever seen them. "What's the point, Laura? Talking doesn't fix anything with you. It just turns into another argument." His words hit me like a punch to the gut. I opened my mouth to argue, to tell him he was wrong, but I couldn't. Deep down, I knew he was right. Every time we tried to talk about something serious, it ended in frustration. I'd push, he'd shut down, and nothing ever got resolved. But this time felt different. He wasn't shutting down out of frustration, he was shutting down because he'd given up. I didn't know what to do. I was angry, sure, but underneath the anger was a gnawing sense of fear. Kevin was slipping away from me, and I didn't know how to stop it. I tried to tell myself it was just a phase, that we were both stressed and needed time to cool off. But the distance between us only grew. I'd hear him laughing with the kids or talking to them about their day, and for a moment, I'd think everything was fine. But the second it was just the two of us, the silence returned, thick and unyielding. And then there was Marcus. I'd be lying if I said I didn't think about him more often now. At work, he was still his confident, charismatic self, and being around him felt like a breath of fresh air compared to the stifling tension at home. He'd ask about my day, listen to my ideas, make me laugh. It was easy, too easy, and I hated how much I looked forward to those moments. But no matter how much I tried to bury myself in work or distract myself with the kids, I couldn't shake the feeling that something fundamental had shifted in my marriage. Kevin wasn't just angry, he was distant in a way that scared me. And the worst part? I couldn't decide if I wanted to fight for us or if I was already giving up too. The night Kevin packed his bag, I felt like I was watching someone else's life unfold. It didn't seem real, like something you'd see in a bad drama, not something that could actually happen in your own living room. But it was real. Too real. And it started so quietly, so calmly, that I didn't realize what was happening until it was too late. It was late, past midnight, and the kids had been asleep for hours. I was sitting on the couch, flipping through Instagram, but not really paying attention to anything on the screen. Kevin had been in the bedroom for a while, and I figured he was just doing what he always did these days, avoiding me. Then I heard it. The unmistakable sound of the closet door sliding open. At first, I didn't think much of it. But when I heard the soft rustle of fabric and the distinct clink of a zipper, my stomach dropped. I put my phone down and stood up, my heart already racing as I walked toward the bedroom. When I opened the door, there he was. Standing by the closet with his old black duffel bag on the bed. He was folding clothes, carefully, methodically, like he had all the time in the world. What are you doing? I asked, my voice shaky but trying to sound firm. He didn't look at me right away. Instead, he continued folding a shirt, smoothing it out before placing it in the bag. Finally, he straightened up and turned to me, his expression calm but unreadable. "I'm leaving," he said simply, like he was telling me he was going out to get milk. I blinked, frozen for a moment. "Leaving?" I repeated, my voice rising. "What do you mean you're leaving? Where are you going?" He didn't answer immediately. He just sipped the bag slowly, the sound slicing through the silence. Then he looked at me, and his eyes, they weren't angry or sad. They were tired, defeated. "You told me not to come back," he said, his voice low and steady. "So, I'm not." I felt like the floor had been ripped out from under me. "I didn't mean it," I said quickly, my voice trembling. "I was upset, Kevin. People say things when they're upset, you know that." He shook his head, slinging the duffel bag over his shoulder. "You've said it more than once, Laura. And maybe you didn't mean it, but I heard you. Every time." My chest tightened, panic rising like a wave. "So, that's it?" I demanded. "You're just going to walk out on your family because of one stupid argument? That's what you're doing now." He stopped at the door, turning back to look at me. "I'm not walking out on my family," he said, his voice still maddeningly calm. "I'm walking out on you." Those words hit like a punch to the gut. I stood there, stunned, as he opened the door and stepped out onto the porch. But I wasn't done. Not yet. I followed him, my anger bubbling over and spilling out in sharp, bitter words. "Oh, so now you're the victim?" I snapped, crossing my arms as I stood on the porch, the cold air biting at my skin. "You're just mad because I don't bow down to you like some little housewife. Is that it?" Kevin turned to face me, the dim porch light casting shadows across his face. "I don't want a submissive wife, Laura," he said, his voice quiet but firm. "I just want a peaceful one." The words knocked the air out of me. I opened my mouth to respond, to argue, but nothing came out. He didn't wait for me to recover. He walked to his car, unlocked the door, and threw the duffel bag into the passenger seat. "You'll be back," I called after him, my voice shaking. "You'll come crawling back when you realize how good you had it here." But he didn't look back. The engine rumbled to life, and the taillights glowed red as he drove away, leaving me standing there in the cold. I went back inside and slammed the door harder than I needed to, leaning against it as my heart pounded in my chest. My hands were shaking, and tears I refused to shed blurred my vision. I told myself I hadn't done anything wrong, that this was his fault, not mine. But deep down, I wasn't so sure. That night, I didn't sleep. Every creak of the house, every shadow outside the window, made me hope I'd hear his car pull back into the driveway. But it didn't. And by the time the sun came up, I was still sitting on the couch, staring at the door, waiting for something I knew wasn't coming. The days that followed Kevin's departure were a blur of silence and unanswered questions. At first, I thought he just needed time to cool off, that he'd be back once he cleared his head. But as each day passed without a text, a call, or even a sign that he cared, the knot in my stomach tightened. The first morning after he left, I woke up on the couch, disoriented and still half hoping to find him in the kitchen making coffee or sitting at the dining table with the kids. But the house was quiet, save for the sound of Jack and Lily playing in the living room. Their laughter felt almost mocking, a stark contrast to the dread swirling inside me. "Where's Daddy?" Jack asked as I poured cereal into his bowl. "He had to go out for a bit," I said, forcing a smile. "He'll be back soon." The words tasted like a lie, even as I said them. I wasn't sure if I believed them myself. That day, I texted him for the first time. It was short, casual, "Where are you?" But my chest tightened as I hit send. I stared at my phone for hours, waiting for the little dots that meant he was typing. Nothing. I sent another text that evening. "The kids are asking about you. Can you at least tell me where you are?" Still nothing. By the second day, I was teetering between anger and worry. I replayed our last conversation over and over, analyzing every word, every look, every pause. I thought about his parting words, "I'm not walking out on my family. I'm walking out on you." The weight of them hung over me like a storm cloud. That evening, I called him. The phone rang, and for a split second, I thought he might actually pick up. But then it went to voicemail. I left a message, my voice sharper than I intended. "Kevin, this is ridiculous. I don't know what kind of point you're trying to make, but you have a family here. You can't just disappear like this. Call me." He didn't. By the third day, my frustration started bubbling over. I busied myself with the kids, packing lunches, helping with homework, keeping them from noticing the growing tension in the house. But the silence between Kevin and me was deafening. It felt like I was living in a world where he didn't exist, and I hated it. I called him again that night, but this time, he sent me straight to voicemail. That was when I started to panic. What if something had happened to him? What if he wasn't just ignoring me? The thought made my stomach twist, but my pride wouldn't let me call anyone else to ask if they'd seen him. What would I even say? That my husband walked out and didn't bother to come back? Instead, I sent another text. "Are you okay? Please just tell me you're okay." No reply. By the fourth day, I couldn't take it anymore. I was sitting in the kitchen, staring at my phone, when it finally buzzed. My heart leapt as I saw his name on the screen, but the text was colder than I expected. "I'll be home later. Don't wait up." Don't wait up? What did that even mean? I called him immediately, my hands trembling as I gripped the phone. He picked up after the second ring, his voice flat and detached. "What does that mean, Kevin? Don't wait up? Are you coming home or not?" I demanded. "It means don't wait up," he said, his tone calm but distant. "So, you're not coming home now?" I asked, my voice rising. "Yep," he said simply, and then he hung up. I stared at the phone in disbelief, my mind racing. This wasn't like Kevin. He was quiet, yes, but he wasn't cruel. At least, he never used to be. What had changed? What had I done that was so unforgivable? The kids went to bed that night without asking about him, but I could tell Jack knew something was wrong. He kept looking at me like he wanted to ask, but I avoided his gaze. I didn't have answers for him or for myself. When Kevin finally walked through the door that night, it was late. Later than usual. He smelled like beer and fried food, and his steps were slow and deliberate. He didn't say a word to me as he walked in, setting his keys on the counter with a carelessness that made my blood boil. Finally decided to come home? I snapped, crossing my arms as I stood in the kitchen doorway. He glanced at me briefly, his eyes dull and rimmed with exhaustion. "I'm tired, Laura," he said quietly, brushing past me like I wasn't even there. "Tired," I repeated, my voice rising. "Tired of what? Me? This family?" He didn't answer. Instead, he walked to the fridge, grabbed a water bottle, and slumped into a chair at the dining table. His silence wasn't just frustrating, it was infuriating. "You don't get to just ignore me, Kevin," I said, stepping closer. "You disappear for days, and now you're acting like it's no big deal? What's wrong with you?" He looked up at me then, his eyes calm but heavy. "I'm not ignoring you," he said simply. "I just don't have anything left to say." His words left me speechless. For the first time in years, I felt completely powerless. The man sitting across from me wasn't the Kevin I knew, or maybe he was, and I just hadn't been paying attention. Either way, the silence between us had become something I could no longer ignore. By the time the call came, I thought I'd been through every possible emotion Kevin could stir in me. The frustration, the anger, the worry, the guilt, I'd felt it all in those endless days of silence. But nothing, absolutely nothing, prepared me for the words I heard on the other end of the line. It started like any other day. I was in the kitchen, packing lunch for Jack and Lily, trying to act like everything was fine. The kids didn't need to know how much their dad's absence weighed on me. They deserved normalcy, even if it was only the illusion of it. But I wasn't fine, and pretending was getting harder by the day. My phone buzzed on the counter. At first, I didn't recognize the number, but I answered anyway, hoping ridiculously that it might be Kevin. "Hello?" I said, balancing the phone between my shoulder and ear as I spread peanut butter on a slice of bread. "Hi, is this Laura Bennett?" a professional-sounding woman's voice asked. "Yes, this is Laura," I replied cautiously, setting the knife down. "This is Angela from Patterson and Lewis Law Firm. I'm calling on behalf of Kevin Bennett regarding a legal separation." I froze. The words hit me like a freight train, and for a moment, I couldn't even process them. "Wait, what?" I stammered, gripping the edge of the counter to steady myself. "A legal separation," Angela repeated, her tone calm and matter-of-fact, as if she hadn't just upended my entire world. "Kevin has requested that we begin the process. You'll be receiving the necessary paperwork in the mail within the next few days." My heart pounded in my chest, and the room seemed to tilt. He didn't even tell me," I managed to say, my voice cracking. "Are you sure you have the right person? This has to be a mistake." "I'm sorry, Mrs. Bennett," Angela said, her tone softening slightly. "I can confirm that this is accurate. If you have any questions, our office is happy to assist." I barely muttered a thank you before hanging up. For a few moments, I just stood there, staring at the phone in my hand as if it might offer some kind of explanation. Kevin wanted a legal separation. My husband, the man who had walked out of our house just days ago, hadn't even bothered to tell me to my face. Instead, he'd let a stranger drop the news on me like it was just another item on their to-do list. The kids' laughter from the living room jolted me back to reality. I quickly wiped my hands on a dish towel and walked into the hallway, out of their earshot. I called Kevin immediately, my hands trembling as I held the phone. It rang twice before going to voicemail. I didn't bother with pleasantries. "Kevin, what the hell is this?" I said, my voice low but shaking with anger. "You file for a separation without even talking to me? Is this your idea of being mature? Call me back." I hung up and leaned against the wall, pressing the heels of my hands against my eyes to stop the tears that threatened to spill. But they came anyway, hot and unstoppable. This wasn't how it was supposed to go. We were supposed to fight, maybe yell, maybe even slam a few doors, but we were supposed to fix things. That's what married people do, isn't it? They fix things. By the time I pulled myself together, the kids had started arguing about something trivial, and I forced myself to focus on them. But the weight of Kevin's decision hung over me like a storm cloud, dark and unrelenting. The rest of the day passed in a haze. I kept checking my phone, half expecting Kevin to call or text, to explain himself, to tell me this was all some terrible misunderstanding. But he didn't. The silence was louder than ever, and for the first time since he'd left, I felt truly alone. That night, after the kids were in bed, I sat on the couch and stared at the wedding photo hanging on the wall. Kevin's arm was around me, his smile wide and genuine. We'd been so young, so full of hope. I tried to remember what that felt like, but it was like trying to hold water in my hands, slipping through my fingers no matter how hard I tried to hold on. I thought about calling my mom or one of my friends, but the thought of explaining what was happening felt impossible. How do you tell someone that your husband, the man you thought you'd spend your life with, has decided to leave you without even saying the words to your face? Instead, I sat there, replaying Angela's voice in my head. You'll be receiving the paperwork in the mail within the next few days. The finality of it made my stomach churn. For the first time in years, I felt completely powerless. And for the first time, I wasn't sure if Kevin was coming back, or if I even wanted him to. The days after the call from Angela passed in a haze of disbelief and pain. The legal separation papers arrived in the mail a few days later, stark and impersonal, like a cold slap in the face. I stared at the envelope for hours before I worked up the courage to open it. Each word on the page felt like a hammer striking a nail into the coffin of my marriage. Kevin had been serious. He wasn't just angry or trying to make a point. He had made up his mind. He wanted out. At first, I tried to convince myself it was just a phase, that he would come around, that he'd wake up one morning and realize he still loved me. But the longer the silence stretched between us, the harder it became to hold on to that hope. Kevin wasn't the kind of man to make rash decisions. If he'd gone as far as filing legal paperwork, it wasn't something he'd done on a whim. The house felt emptier than ever, even though Jack and Lily were still running through it with their boundless energy. Every time they asked about their dad, I gave them the same vague answers. He's working, or he's busy. But how long could I keep that up? How long before they realized their dad wasn't coming home? Late at night, when the kids were asleep, I'd sit on the couch, staring at the papers on the coffee table. My mind raced with questions I couldn't answer. Where had we gone wrong? Was it me? Was it him? Was it both of us? The truth was, I'd been blind to the cracks in our marriage for a long time. I told myself we were just going through a rough patch, that all couples struggled sometimes. But deep down, I knew the truth. I had stopped seeing Kevin as a partner. I'd compared him to people like Marcus, measuring him against a standard he never agreed to. But Kevin wasn't innocent either. He'd shut me out long before that night Marcus came over. He'd chosen silence over confrontation, avoiding the hard conversations we needed to have. And now here we were, two people who had once promised to spend their lives together, reduced to strangers exchanging legal documents. I wanted to reach out to him, to fix things, to beg him to come back. But my pride kept getting in the way. I kept telling myself that if Kevin wanted to leave, that was his choice. I wasn't going to chase after him. And yet, every time I closed my eyes, I saw his face. Not the Kevin who walked out the door, but the Kevin I married. The Kevin who used to make me laugh so hard my stomach hurt, who held my hand during the births of our children, who looked at me like I was the only person in the world. Was that Kevin still in there somewhere? Or had I driven him so far away that he couldn't come back? One night, as I sat alone in the living room, the silence became too much. I picked up my phone and called him. It rang 3 times before going to voicemail. I didn't leave a message. What could I even say? I'm sorry? Sorry didn't feel big enough for what we'd become. The kids were starting to sense that something was wrong. Jack, ever observant, asked me outright one evening, "Is Dad mad at you?" His question caught me off guard, and for a moment I didn't know what to say. "No, sweetheart," I said finally, forcing a smile. "Dad's just figuring some things out right now. He loves you. Don't ever doubt that." Jack nodded, but his eyes were full of questions I couldn't answer. As the days turned into weeks, I started to come to terms with the reality of the situation. Kevin might not come back. And if he didn't, I'd have to figure out how to move forward, for myself and for the kids. But the idea of moving on felt impossible. How do you move on from someone who's still so deeply woven into the fabric of your life? How do you let go of the person who knows you better than anyone else? One night, as I was tucking Lily into bed, she looked up at me with her big, innocent eyes and said, "I miss Daddy." My throat tightened, and I had to blink back tears. "I know, baby," I whispered, kissing her forehead. "I miss him too." And that was the truth. Despite everything, I missed him. I missed his laugh, his steady presence, the way he used to make me feel safe. But missing him didn't change the fact that he was gone. As I lay in bed that night, staring at the ceiling, I realized I was at a crossroads. I could keep holding on to the hope that Kevin would come back, or I could start figuring out how to build a life without him. Neither option felt good, but one thing was certain: nothing would ever be the same. In the quiet of that moment, I made a decision. I didn't know if it was the right one, but it was the only one I could live with. If Kevin wanted out, I wasn't going to stop him. I wasn't going to beg or plead or fight anymore. But that didn't mean I was giving up, not on myself and not on my family. The future was uncertain, and it terrified me. But for the first time in weeks, I felt a flicker of something I hadn't felt in a long time: strength. Maybe I couldn't control what Kevin did, but I could control what I did next. And that, at least, was a start.